The signal came in at 0347 on a Tuesday morning, and it wasn't from any frequency we were supposed to be monitoring. I was alone in the Tracking Operations Center, TOC we called it, running a routine diagnostic cycle on 3 of the base's phased array radar panels. My name is Colton Hargrove. I was a staff sergeant in the United States Air Force, posted to what I'll call Site Meridian, a small missile defense tracking installation roughly 90 miles northwest of any town that appears on a civilian road map. The base sat in a high desert valley at about 5,000 feet, flanked on both sides by barren mountain ranges that looked like the spines of buried animals. In every direction, nothing. Alkali flats, scrub, gravel roads that led to other gravel roads. The nearest gas station was an hour and 40 minutes south, and even that place felt like the edge of the world. I'd been at Site Meridian for 11 months. Before that, I'd spent 4 years at Buckley Space Force Base in Colorado doing satellite operations support. And before that, 2 years in tech school and a childhood in Cheyenne, Wyoming that taught me exactly one useful thing: how to be comfortable with silence. When they asked for volunteers to fill a vacancy at a remote tracking site in the Nevada basin, I raised my hand before the briefing was over. I wanted the quiet. I wanted to be somewhere that the noise of everything, news, people, the low electric hum of normal American life, couldn't reach me. And I got what I asked for. But that Tuesday, at 0347, the quiet broke. The signal appeared on my diagnostic terminal as a narrow-band UHF transmission, unencrypted, repeating on a 7-second loop. It wasn't military. It wasn't aviation. It was a voice, female, clipped, exhausted, speaking a single sentence over and over again. If you can hear this, do not travel south. The cities are gone. I sat there with my coffee going cold in my hand. The radar sweep hummed through its cycle. The fluorescent lights above me buzzed at the same frequency they always did. Everything in the room was the same as it had been 60 seconds ago, and yet something behind my ribs had shifted. You know the feeling. It's not fear exactly. It's the moment before fear, when your body understands something your mind hasn't finished processing. I keyed the frequency into the communications log and tried to isolate the source bearing. The signal was coming from roughly southwest, somewhere in the direction of Tonopah, maybe farther. Maybe as far as the outskirts of Las Vegas, though at that distance the wattage didn't make sense. Someone was broadcasting from the desert with equipment that shouldn't have been able to reach us. I reached for the intercom to contact Master Sergeant Rowan, who was the senior non-commissioned officer on duty that night. Then I stopped. I listened to the loop one more time. If you can hear this, do not travel south. The cities are gone. The word that caught me wasn't gone. It was cities. Plural. I picked up the intercom. Within 20 minutes, there were 6 of us in the TOC. Site Meridian had a total permanent complement of 23. 12 Air Force personnel, 4 civilian contractors who maintained the radar hardware, and 7 Department of Energy security officers who patrolled the perimeter fence and the outer access roads. Not all of them were on site at any given time. That night, we had 19. 6 of us gathered around my terminal, and the rest were either asleep in the barracks or on patrol. Master Sergeant Diane Rowan was a small woman with a jaw like a padlock who had spent 20 years in various corners of Air Force Space Command. She listened to the loop 3 times without speaking. Then she said, "Try Stratcom." I tried. Nothing. "Try Nellis." Nothing. "Creech." Nothing. "Peterson." Static. Not the good kind. Not the kind that means your signal's just not threading through the atmosphere correctly. The dead kind. The kind that sounds like the frequency itself has been abandoned. Rowan looked at me. I looked at her. Technical Sergeant Okafor, who ran our communications array, pulled up a chair and started working through every contact frequency in our book, one by one, while the rest of us stood behind him and watched the silence accumulate. By 0500, Okafor had tried 41 frequencies. He'd reached 2 stations. One was a Coast Guard cutter somewhere in the Pacific that had lost contact with its command 12 hours earlier and was holding position. The other was an automated weather station in Central Oregon that had no human operator. Rowan sent 2 of the DOE security officers, Brennan and Gutierrez, to drive the perimeter and check the gate cameras. She ordered everyone else to the briefing room. When we were all seated, 19 people in a room built for 30, she told us what we knew, which was almost nothing, and what we didn't know, which was almost everything. We have an unidentified broadcast claiming urban areas to our south are compromised, she said. We cannot confirm or deny. We have no contact with any higher command authority. We have no contact with Nellis, Creech, Peterson, or Stratcom. We are functionally communication isolated. Until that changes, we operate under continuity protocols. No one leaves the base. All security postures move to Condition 2. We maintain our radar watch and continue attempting contact. Questions. Private First Class Danny Yoon, who was 20 years old and had been at the site for 3 weeks, raised his hand. Compromised how? Rowan paused. The broadcast doesn't specify. But what do you think it means? It doesn't matter what I think it means. It matters what we can confirm. She was right. And for about 10 hours, that's how we operated. By the book, with measured voices and clean procedures. Okafor cycling through frequencies. Brennan and Gutierrez checking the cameras every hour. The rest of us maintaining the equipment, logging observations, eating meals at normal times, because routine is the thing that holds a military installation together when the larger structure goes silent. It was 15:30 that afternoon when the first vehicle appeared on the southern access road. Our perimeter cameras picked it up at 6 miles out. A white pickup truck, civilian, moving fast and trailing a column of dust that rose 200 feet in the still air. The road that led to Site Meridian wasn't on any public map. It branched off a BLM access road that itself branched off a county highway that most people in Nevada had never heard of. You didn't find us by accident. Someone had either been told where we were or had been driving blind across the desert and gotten extraordinarily lucky. Rowan ordered the main gate sealed and sent Gutierrez and another security officer, a quiet man named Pratt, to meet the vehicle at the outer checkpoint, a steel barrier gate about a quarter mile from the main compound. I watched on the camera feed. The truck stopped. 2 people got out, a man and a woman. The man was maybe 50, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt dark with sweat. The woman was younger, maybe 30, in medical scrubs. She had blood on her shoes. Gutierrez spoke to them through the fence. I couldn't hear what was said, but I watched the body language. The man was talking fast, gesturing south. The woman stood very still with her arms wrapped around herself, not like she was cold, but like she was trying to hold her body together. After about 5 minutes, Gutierrez radioed back. Sergeant Rowan, they're saying there's some kind of outbreak. They're saying Las Vegas is under quarantine. They're saying people are attacking each other. Pause. Attacking each other how? Longer pause. They say people are dying and then not staying dead. The briefing room went silent. I remember the specific quality of that silence. It wasn't shock, not yet. It was the silence of 19 people individually deciding whether what they'd just heard was possible. I watched that decision happen on each face around me, and on about half of them, I watched the answer come back. No, impossible. And on the other half, I watched something worse. the absence of an answer at all. Rowan brought the two civilians inside. Their names were Dale Pressler and Maria Soto. Dale was a retired electrician from Pahrump. Maria was a nurse from Sunrise Hospital in Las Vegas. They had met on the highway 7 hours earlier when Dale stopped to help Maria, whose car had broken down. They had been driving north ever since, on back roads, following a GPS route that Maria had screenshotted before cell service died. Maria did most of the talking. She said the first cases appeared in the emergency department at Sunrise 4 days ago. Patients with bite wounds, high fevers, rapid deterioration. Standard trauma protocol. Then the patients started dying. Cardiac arrest, non-responsive to resuscitation. Then, within minutes of being pronounced, they started moving again. Not waking up, moving. Their eyes were open, but the cognition was gone. They attacked the nearest living person. They bit. They didn't stop. She said the hospital went into lockdown within hours. She said the National Guard arrived, then disappeared. She said the power went out across the east side of the city. She said the highways were gridlocked, then abandoned, then dangerous. She said she drove through Henderson at 4 in the morning and saw things on the road that she would not describe. And that when she looked in my direction and I saw her eyes, I understood that the things she wouldn't describe were the things that had changed the shape of her permanently. Rowan listened to all of it. Then she asked, "Were either of you bitten, scratched, or exposed to bodily fluid from an infected person?" Both said no. Rowan put them in the base infirmary, a 2-bed room with a locking door, for a 12-hour observation period. She posted Pratt outside. She didn't explain herself to anyone. I went back to the TOC and tried to work. The radar panels swept their arcs. The screens showed empty sky. Whatever was happening, it was happening on the ground, in the spaces between the things we were built to watch. By the next morning, 2 more vehicles had arrived at the outer checkpoint. A family of 4 in a minivan, husband, wife, 2 children under 10, and a single man in a Department of Wildlife truck, who said he'd been a game warden in Nye County and had watched his entire district office get overrun in less than an hour. Rowan admitted all of them after screening. We were now at 26 people on a base provisioned for 23. Not a crisis. Not yet. The crisis started on day 4. That was when the power grid failed. Site Meridian drew its primary electricity from a trunk line that ran 60 miles south to a substation near Goldfield. When that line went dead, our backup generators kicked in automatically. We had diesel for approximately 14 days of full operation, or 21 days if we reduced consumption by shutting down non-essential systems. Rowan shut down the non-essential systems within an hour. The radar went dark. The perimeter lights went to half power. The air conditioning in the barracks cut out. And within 2 hours, the interior temperature rose to 97 degrees. This was August in the Nevada basin. Daytime surface temperature outside was 112. The buildings were steel and concrete, and without active cooling, they absorbed heat like kilns. Okafor finally raised a voice on the radio that evening. It was a major from an Army logistics unit somewhere in Utah, he wouldn't say where, who confirmed what Maria had told us. The outbreak was real. It was in every major city west of the Rockies. Military command structures were fragmented. No national-level coordination was functioning. His last instruction, before his signal broke up and vanished, was a single sentence: defend in place and conserve resources. Rowan called a meeting. All 26 of us, plus the 3 new arrivals from that day, another couple and a teenage boy who'd walked 11 miles across the desert alone. "Here is what I know," she said. "The situation beyond our perimeter is not stable. We have no functioning chain of command. We have diesel for approximately 19 days. We have food stores for roughly 30 days at current population. We have water from our on-site well, which is solar pump assisted, and those panels are still functional. Water is not our immediate constraint. Fuel is. She paused. I am going to be direct. If more people arrive, our timeline compresses. I am not going to turn anyone away who reaches our gate alive. But I need every person here to understand the math. The more of us there are, the less time we have, and the harder the decisions become. Danny Yoon raised his hand again. What happens when the diesel runs out? We lose refrigeration, which means we lose the perishable food stores. We lose powered lighting. We lose the ability to run the communications array. We keep the well because the solar panels are independent. We keep the buildings because they're structural. We become, essentially, a walled compound in the desert, with water and whatever shelf-stable food remains. And then? And then, we either receive outside assistance, or we make a decision about whether to stay or go. Nobody said anything for a long time after that. Over the next 6 days, 17 more people arrived. They came in trucks, in sedans, on foot. A family from Tonopah whose house had been surrounded. 2 airmen from Creech who'd driven north when their base was overrun. A rancher and his adult son from a property 40 miles east. A woman in her 60s who wouldn't tell us her name or where she'd come from, only that she could cook and she didn't sleep much. 46 people now. Food for 18 days if we were disciplined. Diesel for 12. And still no infected had appeared near the base. The desert, it seemed, was our best defense. 90 miles of open nothing in every direction, with no shade, no water, no reason for anything, living or otherwise, to walk this way. The heat alone should have been lethal to anything that wasn't sheltered. We told ourselves that. We told ourselves the geography would protect us. On day 10, Brennan drove the morning perimeter check and came back with a look on his face that I will never be able to describe, because the expression doesn't have a name in any language I speak. It lives somewhere between recognition and refusal. There are figures on the South Ridge, he said. I went to the roof of the talk building with binoculars. The South Ridge was about 2 miles from the base, a low spine of rock and scrub that marked the edge of the valley floor. Standing along it, spaced unevenly like fence posts that had been driven in wrong, were 9 figures. They weren't moving. They were just standing in the sun, facing our direction. At 2 miles, through binoculars in heat shimmer, I couldn't make out details. But I could see that they weren't dressed for the desert. One appeared to be wearing a hospital gown. Another was shirtless. They stood with a stillness that no living person maintains in 110-degree heat. Living people shift. They shade their eyes. They seek cover. These figures just stood. How long have they been there? Rowan asked. They weren't there at last night's sweep, Brennan said. So sometime between 2200 and 0600. They walked here in the dark. 90 miles of desert, or 60, or 40. Wherever they'd come from, they'd walked it at night when the temperature dropped to the mid-80s and the desert became merely brutal instead of lethal. And now they stood on the ridge, and they didn't move, and they didn't leave. And the sun climbed over them and baked them, and they remained. By noon, there were 14. By sunset, 21. Rowan convened the senior staff. Herself, me, Okafor, Gutierrez, and Brennan in the TOC. She closed the door. I need options, she said. Gutierrez spoke first. We have 7 rifles, 4 sidearms, and approximately 2,000 rounds between all weapons. If they come down the ridge, we can engage at range. 21 targets, 2,000 rounds, open terrain. It's manageable. If it stays at 21, Okafor said. Correct. Brennan unfolded a topographic map of the valley. The South Ridge is the most exposed approach. East and west, the mountains are steeper and the terrain is rougher. North, the valley opens into a dry lake bed that extends for 30 miles. If we need to leave, north is the only viable direction for vehicles. I studied the map. What's north? Nothing, for a long time. Then Highway 6 crosses east-west. From there, you can reach Ely to the east or Coaldale Junction to the west. How far to Highway 6? About 80 miles. 80 miles of desert with limited fuel. In August. With 46 people, 7 of whom were children. Rowan looked at the map for a long time. Then she said something that changed everything. We're not leaving yet. And we're not waiting for them to come to us. I want to know how they behave. I want to know how fast they move, what triggers them, and whether the heat degrades them. We have a natural laboratory sitting on that ridge. We're going to use it. That's when I understood that Diane Rowan was not just a competent NCO running a procedural response. She was thinking ahead of the crisis. She was thinking like a scientist in a uniform. Over the next 3 days, we observed. We sent 2-person teams to fixed positions along the base perimeter with binoculars and notebooks. We logged every movement, every arrival, every behavior. And what we learned was more disturbing than the initial sight of them. The infected didn't eat. They didn't drink. They stood in direct sunlight, at temperatures that should have killed an unprotected human in 4 to 6 hours. And they persisted. Their skin darkened and cracked. Some of them swayed. A few collapsed and didn't get back up. But most of them endured. They seemed to operate on a metabolic system that no longer required input. No food, no water, no shade. They were burning through whatever remained of their tissues, and they simply didn't stop until the tissues gave out. The ones that collapsed didn't stay down permanently. If the temperature dropped, at dusk or when a cloud passed overhead, which happened exactly once, some of them stirred again. The heat slowed them. It damaged them, but it didn't reliably kill them. More arrived each night. By day 13, we counted over 60 on the South Ridge and in the shallow draws leading up to it. They weren't organized. They weren't coordinating. But they were accumulating, the way sand accumulates against a fence. Something was drawing them toward us. Sound, maybe, or light, or some sense we didn't understand. They faced the base the way sunflowers face the sun, with a tropism that was biological but no longer conscious. On day 13, we also ran out of fresh food. The last of the refrigerated stores had spoiled when we reduced generator cycles. We were now on MREs, canned goods, and whatever dry stores had been stockpiled. Rowan calculated 17 days of food remaining if we maintained 2 meals a day and reduced portions. The civilian group was starting to fracture. Dale Pressler had become a useful figure. He'd organized the non-military adults into work teams for cooking, cleaning, and water hauling. But the rancher's son, a large man named Todd, had begun openly questioning why Rowan was in charge and why military personnel got first access to the armory. "You've got 7 guns and 46 people," Todd said during a meal distribution. "That means 39 of us can't protect ourselves. How is that a plan?" Rowan didn't flinch. "The plan is that 7 trained shooters are more effective than 39 untrained ones. The plan is that ammunition is finite and panic is a multiplier for waste. The plan is that you're alive right now because this facility exists and I'm managing it." Todd didn't push it further. Not then. Day 15 is when we lost someone for the first time. Private Yoon had been assigned to the South Observation Post, a sandbagged position on the roof of the maintenance shed with a clear sightline to the ridge. His shift was 0200 to 0600, the coldest hours when the infected were most active. He had a rifle, a radio, and instructions to observe and report only. At 0340, his radio went silent. When his relief arrived at 0600, they found the position empty. The rifle was still there. The radio was still there. The sandbags had been disturbed on the south side, as if someone had climbed over them. We searched the area around the shed. We found boot prints leading south toward the perimeter fence. They led to a section where the chain link had been cut from the inside. Danny Yoon had left the base voluntarily. He had cut the fence, walked through it, and walked south towards 60 infected figures standing on a ridge in the dark. We never found him. We never found a body. Brennan followed the tracks for 400 yards until they merged with the hardpan and vanished. Rowan addressed the group that morning. She was brief. She said that Private Yoon had left the perimeter during his watch shift and was presumed lost. She said that the fence had been repaired. She said that anyone experiencing psychological distress should report to Maria Soto, who had been functioning as our de facto medical officer. What she didn't say, what she told me privately, in the TOC, with the door closed, was this. He wasn't attacked. He wasn't pulled. He walked out there on his own. And that means the threat isn't only on the ridge. It's inside the building. I understood what she meant. Not infection. Despair. The slow, airless weight of a situation that has no visible end, and no visible help, and no visible reason to believe that endurance leads anywhere other than a longer version of the same suffering. Danny Yoon was 20 years old. He'd been in the Air Force for 11 months. He had seen his world disappear in 2 weeks, and somewhere in the small hours of a desert night, he had decided that walking into the dark was easier than sitting in the light with nothing to wait for. I did not sleep well that night, or the next night, or the next. On day 17, Rowan made her decision. "We're leaving," she said. Day 19. Dawn. North, across the lake bed to Highway 6. We take 2 trucks, 1 van, all remaining fuel, all remaining food, all water we can carry. We disable whatever we leave behind so it can't be used against us. We travel at night when the heat is survivable and the infected are active, but the vehicles give us speed advantage. We stop during daylight to rest in whatever shelter we can find. Todd immediately protested. "You want us to drive into the open desert with 60 of those things behind us? What about the bunker?" He meant the hardened facility beneath the TOC, a reinforced underground room originally designed to survive a nuclear exchange. It was spacious enough for about 15 people and had its own air filtration, though it ran on the same diesel generator as everything else. "The bunker is a tomb," Rowan said. "It has no independent power and no exit other than the one we enter through. If we go down there and they come through the surface, we die underground in the dark. You don't know they'll come through. I know their numbers are increasing every night, and our resources are decreasing every day. Staying here is a curve that only goes one direction." Todd looked around the room for support. A few people wouldn't meet his eyes. A few nodded at Rowan. The rancher put his hand on his son's arm and said quietly, "She's right, Todd." The vote wasn't formal, but it was clear. We would leave. The next 36 hours were the most organized and the most terrifying of my life. Every useful item on the base had to be sorted, packed, or destroyed. Food was loaded into plastic bins. Water went into every container we could find. Jerry cans, bottles, a 50-gallon drum that Gutierrez welded to the bed of one of the trucks. Weapons were distributed. 7 rifles to the 7 most proficient shooters, sidearms to 4 others. The rest carried tools, tire irons, crowbars, a fire axe from the maintenance shed. Okafor rigged a portable radio from salvaged components. It ran on batteries and had a range of maybe 20 miles on a good day, but it was something. Maria packed a medical kit from the infirmary supplies. Dale organized the vehicles. 2 military trucks with bench seating in the beds, 1 civilian van. We could fit everyone if people sat close. It would be uncomfortable. It would be hot. It would be 80 miles of desert in the dark. But we could do it. The evening of day 18, I stood on the roof of the TOC and looked south. The ridge was thick with them now. 90, maybe more. Some had come down the slope and were standing on the valley floor, maybe a mile and a half from the fence. In the last light, they looked like a forest of dead trees. I looked north. The lake bed stretched out white and featureless, a dry ocean of alkali crust that reflected the dying light like snow. Somewhere beyond it, Highway 6. Somewhere beyond that, whatever was left. I went downstairs and helped pack the last of the MREs. We rolled out at 04:30 on day 19. 3 vehicles, 45 people. It was still dark and the temperature was 82 degrees, which in the Nevada basin in August qualifies as cool. Rowan drove the lead truck. I rode shotgun with the map and a flashlight with a red lens so it wouldn't kill her night vision. Gutierrez drove the second truck. Dale drove the van. Brennan and Pratt rode in the truck beds with rifles, facing backward, watching the road behind us. The base fell away behind us quickly. There was no road north, just a gravel track that deteriorated into packed earth, then into the lake bed itself. The surface was hard and flat, and the tires made a crunching sound like walking on cereal. The headlights lit up nothing but white ground and white dust, and the occasional dark shape of a rock or a dead shrub. For the first hour, nobody spoke. Then Rowan said, very quietly, "Hargrove, do you see that?" I looked where she was looking. Off to the west, maybe half a mile, a cluster of shapes was moving across the lake bed. They were dark against the white ground, low and fast, not running exactly, but moving with a fluid, loping gait that was faster than any walk. "How many?" I asked. "I count 8. They're paralleling us." "I know." She didn't speed up. The trucks were running at about 35 miles an hour, which was as fast as we could safely go on this surface without risking a broken axle. The shapes kept pace. They didn't close the distance. They didn't fall behind. They matched our speed, like escort swimmers alongside a boat. "They know where we are," I said. "They've known since we turned the engines on." We drove. The shapes stayed with us. After about 20 minutes, a second group appeared to the east. 5 or 6 more, moving in the same pattern. And then, ahead of us, a single figure standing alone in the middle of the lake bed, facing our direction. Rowan didn't slow down. She didn't swerve. She drove straight at it, and at the last second it lunged toward the driver's side, and she jerked the wheel slightly, and we passed it close enough that I heard its hand slam against the truck bed. A flat, meaty sound, like someone slapping a table. In the side mirror, I watched it stumble and then turn to follow us. It receded into the dark. "Everyone check in," Rowan said on the radio. Gutierrez, "Truck 2, clear, we saw it." Dale, "Van, clear, Jesus Christ." "Stay tight, maintain speed, do not stop for anything." We drove for 3 hours. The lake bed ended and the terrain became rougher. Low hills, sandy washes, patches of scrub that scraped the undercarriages. The paralleling groups fell behind on the rough ground. Whatever biological system allowed them to walk didn't handle uneven terrain well. They stumbled. They fell. Some of them got up. Some didn't. Dawn came like a wound opening. First red, then orange, then the white hammer of full desert sun. By 07:30, the temperature was already over 100. We found a shallow canyon, really just a cut in the rock, maybe 30 feet deep, and pulled the vehicles under the overhang of the eastern wall, where there would be shade until early afternoon. Rowan posted 2 lookouts on the canyon rim. The rest of us tried to sleep. 45 people packed into 3 vehicles and the narrow strip of shade along a rock wall. Children cried. Adults stared at nothing. Maria moved through the group, checking for dehydration, handing out water in measured amounts. I found a flat spot against the canyon wall and sat down. The rock was already warm. I closed my eyes and tried to think about something other than the sound that figure's hand had made against the truck. I couldn't. I must have slept, because the next thing I knew, Brennan was shaking my shoulder and the shadows had shifted. It was mid-afternoon. The shade was contracting. Half the group was now in direct sunlight. "Problem," Brennan said. I followed him to the canyon rim. He pointed south. On the flat ground below, visible in the heat shimmer like objects seen through water, a line of figures was approaching. Not 8 or 10, not 20. I stopped counting at 50. They were still 2 miles out, moving slowly in the full heat, stumbling, some of them barely upright. The sun was doing what the sun does. It was breaking them down. But they kept coming. One would fall, and the others would walk over it without acknowledgement, without pause. "They followed us," I said. "They followed the tracks," Brennan said. "Tire tracks across the lake bed. A child could follow them." I hadn't thought of that. We'd left a trail as clear as a highway, pressed into the white alkaline surface, and they had followed it the way water follows a channel. We couldn't wait for nightfall. We had to move now, in the worst heat of the day, and hope the vehicles could outrun them, and the engines wouldn't overheat, and the tires wouldn't blow on the hot ground. Rowan made the call in 30 seconds. "Load up, we drive, now." The children were crying from the heat. 2 of the older civilians were disoriented, heat exhaustion already setting in. Maria forced water into them, and we loaded them into the van, where the shade was marginally better. Dale had the engine running before everyone was seated. We climbed out of the canyon on the north side and hit open desert again. The terrain here was worse, rocky, uneven, crossed by dry washes that jolted the suspension hard enough to bounce people off the bench seats. The temperature inside the vehicles was unbearable. I could feel the heat radiating through the firewall, through the floor, through the glass. Sweat evaporated before it could form droplets. We drove for 2 hours. One of the elderly civilians, a man named Arthur who'd arrived at the base on day 8, lost consciousness. Maria called it on the radio. Heat stroke. She needed to cool him down. We needed to stop. Rowan pulled the convoy behind a rock formation, and we made shade with tarps stretched from the vehicle roofs to the rocks. Maria packed Arthur's neck and armpits with wet cloths from our water supply and started an IV from the infirmary kit. His breathing was shallow, and his skin was dry and hot, and his eyes, when she opened them, were fixed and dilated. He died at 1647. Maria called it. She'd been a nurse for 11 years, and she called it the way nurses do, with a clinical precision that holds the grief at arm's length for exactly as long as necessary to finish the job. We didn't have time to bury him. We wrapped him in a tarp and placed him in the truck bed because no one could bear the idea of leaving him on the ground for the things behind us. Rowan gave us 5 minutes. People wept. People prayed. The rancher's son, Todd, stood apart from the group with his arms at his sides and his eyes on the southern horizon and said nothing. We drove again at sunset. The temperature dropped. The engines ran cooler. The road, such as it was, improved as we angled northeast toward where Brennan's map showed Highway 6 crossing the basin. We drove with the headlights off, navigating by moonlight and GPS, because Rowan didn't want to advertise our position. At 22:15, Brennan's voice came over the radio from the truck bed. "I can see pavement." Highway 6. A 2-lane road stretching east to west across the desert, empty, silent, undamaged. We pulled onto it, and the tires hummed on smooth asphalt, and that sound, that simple, normal sound of rubber on a paved road, made several people in the truck cry. Rowan turned east, toward Ely, toward the possibility that somewhere in this vast, emptied country, something was still holding together. We drove for 40 miles on Highway 6 without seeing another vehicle. The road was clear. The night was still. The desert on either side was featureless under the moon, and nothing moved in it. Then Gutierrez in truck 2 said, "I'm pulling to the shoulder. Engine temperature is red." We stopped. Gutierrez opened the hood, and a cloud of steam rose and dispersed in the dry air. The radiator was cracked. 90 miles of rough desert had finally broken something. 15 minutes. That's what we had before the things behind us, if they were still following, if they'd reached the highway, could close the distance. 15 minutes, probably more, possibly less. Math with no good answer. "We consolidate," Rowan said. "Everything into truck 1 and the van. Leave truck 2. We moved fast. Supplies, weapons, people, everything pulled from the disabled truck and packed into the remaining 2 vehicles. 44 people, 2 vehicles. Inhumane conditions. Children on laps. Adults standing in the truck bed, holding the rail, exposed to the wind and the night and whatever might be on the road behind us. We left truck 2 on the shoulder with its hood up and its headlights on, pointing south, like a scarecrow. Brennan's idea. Give them something to walk toward that isn't us. It was cold math, and it was probably useless, and it was the kind of decision you make at 10 o'clock at night in the desert when you're running out of everything and the only currency left is time. We drove east. At midnight, we reached the junction where Highway 6 met a smaller road heading north into a range of low mountains. A road sign, bullet-pocked and leaning, read, "Current Creek, 22 miles. Below it, someone had spray-painted in red, "Alive here." Rowan stopped the truck. She looked at the sign. She looked at me. "Could be a trap," I said. "Could be people. Could be both." She sat with her hands on the wheel. The engine idled. In the back of the truck, 44 people waited for a decision from a woman who had never asked to make decisions for anyone beyond the 23-person complement of a remote radar installation. "We go," she said, "because the alternative is driving east until the fuel runs out and dying on a highway." We turned north. The road climbed into the mountains through a series of switchbacks. The terrain changed. Pinyon pine appeared, then juniper, then actual trees casting actual shadows. The air cooled. The smell changed from dust and alkali to something green and organic and so unexpected that it felt like a hallucination. At mile 14, we hit a checkpoint. 2 vehicles parked across the road, nose to nose. Behind them, a wall of sandbags. Behind the sandbags, 3 people with rifles. Rowan stopped the truck and turned on the headlights. She rolled down her window and held both hands out where they could be seen. A voice from behind the sandbags. "How many are you?" 44. Military and civilian. We have wounded and children." Silence. Then a different voice, older. "Are any of you bitten?" "No." "Can you prove that?" "We'll submit to any inspection you require." More silence. Then the older voice again. "Pull forward slow. Engines off. Everyone out with hands visible. We'll check you one at a time." It took over an hour. They checked every person. Arms, legs, necks, torsos. They were methodical and not rough. They used flashlights and gloved hands. The person doing most of the inspections was a woman in her 40s with a stethoscope around her neck. A doctor, or something close to it. When they were done, the older man, lean, gray-bearded, wearing a flannel jacket and a holstered revolver, approached Rowan. "I'm Gideon Marsh," he said. "I'm not in charge because nobody's in charge, but I can take you somewhere safe." We followed them up the road for another 8 miles. The mountains closed in, the trees thickened, and then the road opened into a valley, small, maybe 3 miles across, ringed by ridges, and in the center of it, illuminated by the faint glow of generators and firelight, was a settlement. Not a base, not a compound, a settlement. 40 or 50 structures, some permanent buildings, some tents, some improvised shelters made of corrugated metal and tarps. A creek ran through the center of it, actual running water. And the sound of it was so foreign and so beautiful that I sat in the truck and listened to it before I could make myself move. Gideon told us the story over the next 2 days as we were processed, fed, assigned sleeping areas, and integrated into what they called Current Creek Station. The settlement had started 3 weeks before the outbreak, when a retired Army engineer named Catherine Dow had purchased 80 acres in the valley as a planned off-grid homestead. She'd been building when the world ended. Her property had a well, a creek, solar panels, and a partially completed workshop. When the first refugees arrived, 3 families from Ely, she'd let them stay. Then more came. Then more. Now there were 112 people, plus our 44. 156 in a mountain valley with water, some arable land, and the natural fortification of terrain that the infected couldn't easily navigate. The same rough ground that had slowed them on the lake bed, the uneven rock, the steep grades, the dense brush, made the valley approaches a natural choke point. They'd only had 2 incursions, both small. Both stopped at the outer checkpoints. It wasn't safe. It wasn't permanent. But it was something. On our 3rd day there, I helped dig a grave for Arthur on a hillside above the creek. The rancher said a few words. Maria stood at the back and didn't speak. Dale Pressler carved a cross from juniper wood. We didn't have Arthur's last name. He'd never told us, and no one had asked. And that failure of basic human attention weighed on me more than I expected. That evening, I found Rowan sitting on the creek bank alone. She was watching the water move over the rocks, and her hands were in her lap. And she looked small in a way I'd never seen her look before. At the base, she'd been a force, compressed, decisive, armored by procedure and rank. Here, in the firelight, with the sound of water and distant voices, the armor was off. And underneath it was a 44-year-old woman who had carried 45 lives across 90 miles of desert, and lost one and saved the rest, and didn't know what to do with what that had cost her. I sat down next to her. We didn't talk for a long time. Then she said, "Yoon." I nodded. I keep thinking I should have seen it. He was 20 years old. I should have been watching him. You were watching everything. You can't watch everything and also see everything. That's the same thing. No, it isn't. Watching is pointing your attention somewhere. Seeing is understanding what you find there. You can't do both at the same time for 23 people, plus 22 more, plus a base, plus a threat, plus the food, plus the fuel. You're a person, Diane. You did what a person can do. She picked up a stone from the creek bed and turned it over in her hand. He walked out there. He cut the fence and walked toward them. I keep trying to understand it, and I can't. Was he giving up? Was he trying to prove something? Was he just so tired of being afraid that the thing he was afraid of started to look like relief? I didn't have an answer. I still don't. After a minute, she threw the stone into the creek and stood up and said, "We need to set up a watch rotation. This valley has 4 approaches, and I only see 2 covered." And she walked back toward the settlement, and she was Master Sergeant Rowan again, and the armor was back on. And I understood that the armor wasn't denial. It was structure. It was the thing she built every morning so that the weight of Danny Yoon and Arthur and every uncounted body on the highway didn't crush her flat. And I understood that I needed to build my own version of that, or I wouldn't survive either. Not the infected, not the desert. This. The afterward. The carrying. Weeks passed. I stopped counting days. The calendar became seasonal rather than numerical. We planted in the valley's small arable patches. We repaired structures. We established patrol routes. We argued about resource allocation and governance, and all the tedious, vital mechanics of people living together in a space that wasn't designed for this many lives. Catherine Dow and Diane Rowan became the settlement's informal dual leadership. Dow for infrastructure and agriculture, Rowan for security and organization. They disagreed frequently and resolved their disagreements with a pragmatism that I found more hopeful than any speech or gesture. They didn't agree because they liked each other. They agreed because the alternative was disintegration, and neither of them could live with that. Okafor got his portable radio working with better range by cannibalizing components from a ham radio setup one of the Eli families had brought. He started making contact with other survivors. Scattered, isolated, mostly small groups in defensible terrain. A ranch in eastern Nevada with 11 people. A Forest Service station in the Rubies with 6. A mining camp near Pioche with 23. Each contact was a point of light in the dark, and Okafor logged them on a map he'd pinned to the workshop wall. And slowly, the map began to look less like a void and more like a constellation. One evening, about 6 weeks after we'd arrived, I climbed to the top of the ridge east of the settlement. It was September now, and the worst of the heat had broken, and the sky was enormous and clean and full of stars in a way that cities never allowed. Below me, the settlement glowed with small fires and the faint blue light of solar-powered lamps. I could hear voices. Someone was playing a guitar. Badly, but with commitment. I thought about Site Meridian, still sitting in its valley 90 miles south. Empty now. Its radar panels pointed at a sky that no longer needed watching. I thought about the TOC where I'd first heard that signal. The woman's voice, exhausted and precise, telling anyone who could hear that the cities were gone. I wondered if she was alive. I wondered if she'd found something like this. I thought about Danny Yoon, who was 20 years old and who walked into the desert because he couldn't carry the weight of what the world had become. I thought about Arthur, who died of heat under a tarp while we ran from the things that wouldn't stop walking. I thought about Maria Soto, who had looked into the worst of it and still, every morning, put on her competence like a coat and went to work keeping people alive. I thought about the things on the ridge at Site Meridian, standing in the sun with their broken bodies and their empty faces, waiting for nothing, driven by something that had once been a brain and was now just a signal, an impulse, a hunger that had no purpose and no end. And I thought about how the distance between us and them was not as wide as we wanted it to be. Because they persisted without reason, and so did we. The difference was that we could choose why. We could assign meaning. We could look at a valley with a creek in it and say, "This is worth defending." We could look at a stranger and say, "You are worth feeding." We could look at the future, blind, uncertain, probably violent, definitely hard, and choose to walk toward it rather than away from it. But meaning doesn't arrive on its own. You have to build it, the same way Catherine Dow built her homestead. One post at a time, one trench at a time, one decision at a time, in soil that doesn't owe you anything. The first real test of the settlement came 11 days after we arrived. Okafor had been running his radio from a workbench in Catherine's workshop, scanning frequencies every morning and evening. Most of what he found was dead air. Occasionally, a fragment of automated signal, a weather beacon, a looping emergency broadcast that no one had updated in weeks. But on our 11th morning, he picked up a voice. A man, young, speaking fast, identifying himself as a National Guard corporal named Webb, transmitting from a school gymnasium in Lund, about 45 miles east of us. Webb said he had 61 people in the gymnasium, civilians, families. He said they'd been there for 3 weeks and the food was gone. He said the water was brown coming out of the taps and he'd lost 2 children to dysentery. He said the infected were in the town, not in large numbers, but enough that they couldn't move on foot safely. He said he had 1 working truck and not enough fuel to reach anywhere. He was asking if anyone could help. Okafor brought the transmission to Rowan and Dow. I was there when they listened to it. Rowan's face didn't change. Dow's did. Her mouth tightened and her eyes went to the map on the wall, calculating distances and risk the way she calculated everything, with the quiet precision of someone who builds structures for a living. 45 miles, Dow said, each way. Through Open Basin for the first 30, Rowan said. Then into the Lund Valley, which we haven't scouted. We have fuel for 1 round trip in the remaining truck. Maybe. And if we send the truck and it doesn't come back, we lose our only vehicle. They looked at each other. This was how their disagreements always started, with facts arranged in a line, each one true, each one pointing in a different direction. Dow spoke first. 61 people, Diane. I know how many. Children dying of dysentery. I know what's killing them. Then what are we discussing? Rowan leaned against the workbench. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "We're discussing whether saving 61 people we've never met is worth risking the 156 people we've already saved. That's what we're discussing. And if you think that's a simple calculation, then you haven't been paying attention to the math." It wasn't cruel. It was precise. And it was the thing that nobody else in the settlement would have said aloud, which is why Rowan was the one who said it. Dow didn't argue. She said, "Then let's change the math. We don't send the truck empty. We send it with water purification tablets, oral rehydration supplies, and a route map to this valley. We give them the means to survive long enough to move, and we give them a destination. If they make it here, we absorb them. If they don't, we didn't sacrifice our vehicle." Rowan considered this. "Who drives?" "I'll ask for volunteers." 3 people volunteered. Brennan, who had become the settlement's most reliable scout. Dale Pressler, because he said he'd been useless for too long and needed to be useful. And Todd, the rancher's son, who had spent weeks being angry and difficult, and who now, standing in the workshop with his hat in his hands, said simply, "I can drive at night, and I can shoot. Let me go." They left at dusk. Brennan drove. Todd rode shotgun with a rifle. Dale sat in the bed with the supplies and a second rifle and a hand-drawn map that Okafor had marked with every terrain feature he could identify from the topographic charts. They were gone for 3 days. Those 3 days were among the longest of my life, and I wasn't even on the truck. I was in the valley, doing my rotation. Morning patrol on the eastern ridge, afternoon work on the irrigation trench we were digging to extend the creek's reach to a second planting area, evening shift on the radio with Okafor. Normal days, if anything could be called normal. But underneath every task, underneath every conversation, was the weight of 3 people driving through the desert toward a place we'd never seen, carrying supplies we couldn't spare, based on a radio transmission we couldn't verify. Maria kept busy. She always kept busy. It was her way of managing what I'd come to recognize as a grief so deep it had become structural, built into the architecture of her personality like a load-bearing wall. She'd lost her entire hospital. Every colleague, every patient she'd been treating when the outbreak hit the ER. She'd driven out of Las Vegas through streets she wouldn't describe. And she'd kept driving. And she'd arrived at Site Meridian in blood-stained scrubs. And she'd immediately started working, because working was the only thing that held the wall in place. On the second night of the truck's absence, I found her in the medical tent, a canvas structure we'd erected near the creek, organizing supplies by flashlight. She was sorting bandages into piles by size, which she'd already done twice that week. "Maria." She didn't look up. "I'm reorganizing. The system I had wasn't efficient." "The system you had was fine." "It wasn't. The 4-inch gauze was behind the 2-inch gauze, and in an emergency, you reach for the first thing you find. Sequence matters." I sat down on the cot across from her. "Are you sleeping?" "Enough." "That's not an answer." She stopped sorting. She held a rolled bandage in both hands and stared at it. "I sleep when I'm tired enough that the dreams don't come." "That takes a while. Some nights it doesn't happen." "What do you dream about?" "Room 4, bed B. A man named Gerald who came in with a bite on his forearm and a fever of 104. I started an IV. I hung fluids. He coded at 11:47 p.m. We called it at 11:52. At 11:55 he sat up. His IV was still in his arm. He looked at me, and there was nothing in his eyes. Not anger, not confusion, not pain. Nothing. Like looking into a window with no room behind it. She set the bandage down carefully. I dream about the 3 minutes between when we called it and when he moved. Because in those 3 minutes, I was writing his chart. I was documenting his death. And he was already not dead. And I didn't know. And I keep thinking, what if I'd been watching? What if I'd seen the moment it happened? Would I understand it? Would I understand any of this? I didn't have an answer. Nobody did. The thing that was happening to the world didn't come with an explanation. It just came. You're keeping people alive, Maria. That's not nothing. It's not enough either. It doesn't have to be enough. It just has to be what you can do. She looked at me for a long time. Then she picked up the bandage and put it in the correct pile and went back to sorting. And I sat with her for another hour, not talking, just being present. Because sometimes that's the only thing you can offer someone whose grief is bigger than any words you have. The truck came back on the third evening. I heard it before I saw it. The grind of the engine coming up the switchbacks, a sound I'd learned to associate with either salvation or disaster, depending on the day. I ran to the checkpoint with Gutierrez and 2 others, rifles ready, hearts hammering. It was Brennan. He was driving. Todd was in the passenger seat, asleep or unconscious. I couldn't tell which. Dale was in the bed, sitting among empty supply containers, and next to him were 3 people I'd never seen. A woman holding an infant, a teenage boy with his arm in a makeshift sling. Brennan parked and got out, and he looked like he'd aged 10 years. His face was sunburned, and his lips were cracked, and he moved with the slow, mechanical gait of someone running on fumes. "Lund is gone," he said. "The gymnasium was overrun 2 days before we got there. We found—" He stopped. He swallowed. "We found what was left. These 3 were hiding in a storage room in the back of the building. They're all that made it out. The corporal, Webb, he was at the door of the gymnasium when they came through. He held it long enough for some people to scatter. These 3 got to the storage room. Everyone else—" He didn't finish. Rowan, who had arrived at the checkpoint, asked, "The supplies?" "We left them at the gymnasium, in case anyone comes back." He paused. "Nobody's coming back." Todd stirred in the passenger seat. I opened the door and he blinked at me. He had a gash across his forehead that had been closed with butterfly bandages. Maria's supplies. "What happened to you?" I asked. "Rolled through a wash in the dark, hit a rock. Truck almost flipped." He looked past me at the settlement, at the fires and the lights and the sounds of people. "Made it, though." I helped him out of the truck. His legs were unsteady. As he walked past me toward the medical tent, he put his hand on my shoulder. Not a pat, not a squeeze, just a moment of contact, palm against fabric. And then he kept walking, and he didn't say anything else, and he didn't need to. The woman with the infant was named Rachel. The teenager was her nephew, Luis. The infant was 7 weeks old, born 3 weeks into the apocalypse, in a gymnasium in a dying town, delivered by a veterinarian who was the closest thing to a doctor they'd had. The baby's name was Gabriel, and when Maria examined him in the medical tent, he was underweight and dehydrated, but alive. And Maria held him for a long time after the examination was over, standing in the tent with this impossibly small person against her chest. And her face had an expression I'd never seen on it before. Not happiness, not grief, but something between the two. Something that had no name, like the expression on Brennan's face when he'd first come back from the perimeter at Site Meridian. A recognition that the world now contained things that didn't fit into the categories you'd built for it. We absorbed Rachel and Luis and Gabriel. 159 now. The numbers kept growing, and the supplies kept shrinking, and the math never balanced, and we kept going anyway. Weeks turned. September cooled into October. The desert below the mountains shifted from white heat to amber stillness. The cottonwoods along the creek turned yellow. And that color, simple, ordinary, the kind of thing you'd drive past in the old world without a second glance, became extraordinary in its normalcy. Seasons still changed. The earth still tilted on its axis. Whatever had happened to humanity, the planet hadn't noticed. We built. That's what I remember most about those weeks. The building. Dow designed a gravity-fed water system using PVC pipe salvaged from an abandoned ranch house 4 miles north. Okafor constructed a repeater antenna on the eastern ridge that doubled his radio range. Dale and Todd and a crew of volunteers erected a communal dining structure from corrugated steel and juniper poles. Rowan organized the perimeter into 4 sectors, each with a designated watch team, each with a fallback protocol, each with a cache of supplies buried at a rally point in case the valley was overrun and we had to scatter. The infected appeared occasionally. singles or pairs that had wandered into the mountain terrain and stumbled toward the valley following some instinct we still didn't understand. The watch teams handled them at the outer checkpoints, quietly and efficiently. And after a while, even that became routine, which was its own kind of horror. The normalization of killing things that used to be people. Nobody talked about it. Everybody carried it. One evening in mid-October, Okafor called me to the workshop. He had something on the radio. It was a woman's voice. Clear, steady, broadcasting on a frequency close to the one I'd first intercepted at Site Meridian 2 months ago. She was identifying herself as Dr. Lena Corrales, transmitting from a research station in the Ruby Mountains, roughly 120 miles northeast of us. She said she was part of a group of 11 scientists and support staff from a University of Nevada field biology program who'd been conducting fieldwork when the outbreak began. She said they'd been studying the infected. She said they had observations. She said they needed to share them with anyone who was still doing organized survival. Okafor looked at me. "What do you think?" "I think Rowan needs to hear this." Rowan listened to the recording 3 times. Then she asked Okafor to establish a live connection. It took 2 days of scheduling and signal coordination, but on a cold October evening, Rowan sat in the workshop with a radio handset and spoke to Dr. Corrales directly. I was there. Dow was there. Okafor managed the signal. Corrales spoke for 20 minutes. What she described changed how we understood what we were facing. The infected were deteriorating. Not just the ones in the desert. All of them. Corrales' team had been observing a group of approximately 30 infected in a valley near their station, tracking them daily with binoculars and spotting scopes. Over 8 weeks, the group had lost roughly 40% of its number to what Corrales called metabolic collapse. Without food or water intake, the infected bodies were consuming themselves, muscle tissue, fat reserves, organ function, all declining on a predictable curve. The heat accelerated it. Cold slowed it but didn't stop it. Her estimate was that a typical infected individual, in temperate conditions with no caloric intake, would remain ambulatory for approximately 3 to 4 months after turning. In extreme heat, less. In cold, potentially longer, but with reduced mobility. "They're not immortal," she said. "They're not even durable. They're burning through a finite biological resource, and when it's gone, they stop. The question is whether we can outlast that timeline." Rowan asked, "What's your confidence level on that estimate?" "Moderate. We're working with limited observation and no lab capacity. But the trend is consistent. They are degrading. Every single one we've tracked has either collapsed or shown significant loss of function. Given enough time, this threat is self-limiting." Silence in the workshop. I watched Rowan's face. I watched Dow's. I watched Okafor's hands frozen on the radio dial. Self-limiting. The words sat in the room like something fragile that no one wanted to touch, because touching it might reveal it to be either real or false, and neither outcome was simple. Rowan said, "If that's true, then survival isn't about fighting. It's about enduring." "That's been my conclusion," Corrales said. "Fortify, sustain, wait. Let biology do what biology does." After the transmission ended, Rowan sat in the workshop for a long time. Dow left to check the water system. Okafor started logging the contact on his map. I stayed. "Do you believe her?" I asked. "I believe she believes it. And I believe her observations are probably accurate. But probably isn't certainty. And 3 to 4 months is a long time when you're feeding 159 people on canned goods and creek water. It's something, though. It is. It's something." She stood up and stretched her back. "Something is better than nothing. But it's not better than a plan." Let's make sure we have both. So we planned. Dow redesigned the planting schedule for a winter crop. Cold hardy greens, root vegetables, anything that could grow in the valley's short season. Rowan expanded the patrol range and started sending scout teams to map the surrounding terrain in detail. Water sources, shelter options, supply caches, escape routes. Okafor continued building his radio network, adding contacts, sharing Corias's findings with every group he reached. The map on the workshop wall filled in slowly. A dot near Ely. A dot near Pioche. A dot in the Rubies. 2 dots in central Utah. A dot as far away as eastern Oregon. Each one a small group of survivors, each one holding on, each one connected to the others by nothing more than radio waves and the stubborn human refusal to disappear. I took on the job of maintaining the eastern patrol route, a 5-mile loop along the ridge that gave a clear view of the valley approaches. I walked it every morning, alone, with a rifle and a canteen and the vast Nevada sky overhead. It became my ritual, my version of Rowan's armor, Maria's sorting, Dale's carpentry. The thing I did each day that gave the day a shape, that made it distinct from the day before and the day after, that kept the hours from collapsing into a single, undifferentiated weight. On one of those morning patrols in late October, I came across something that stopped me. In a shallow ravine just off the ridge trail, half concealed by juniper scrub, was an infected figure. It was sitting on the ground with its back against a rock. It wasn't moving. Its eyes were open but unfocused, staring at the sky with an expression that, and I know how this sounds, and I know what it means to project onto something that no longer has interiority, looked like exhaustion. Not pain, not hunger, exhaustion. It was wearing the remnants of a Nevada Highway Patrol uniform. The name tag read Dominguez. The body was emaciated, the skin dried and cracked, the hands curled into loose fists at its sides. One of its shoes was missing. It must have walked a very long distance on one bare foot and one booted foot, across rock and scrub and alkali, following whatever blind signal had pulled it toward us. It didn't react to my presence. I stood 20 feet away, rifle raised, and watched it for several minutes. Its chest wasn't moving. Its eyes didn't track. It sat there with the absolute stillness of a machine that had run out of power. And I understood with a clarity that I hadn't had before that Corias was right. They were finite. This one had reached its limit. The hunger, the signal, the impulse, whatever it was that had animated it after death, had consumed everything that was available. And now there was nothing left to consume, and it had simply stopped. I lowered the rifle. I stood there for a while longer. Then I walked back to the settlement and reported it to Rowan, and she logged it, and Brennan went out later to confirm, and that was that. But I kept thinking about Officer Dominguez, not as a threat, as a person who had existed before the thing that happened to them happened. They'd had a patrol route, too. They'd had a morning ritual. Coffee, maybe, the way I'd had coffee in the talk on the night the signal came in. They'd had a name and a job, and a life built of small, ordinary decisions. And all of it had been erased by something that turned them into a walking impulse. And the impulse had carried them across God knows how many miles of desert, until even the impulse wasn't enough, and they'd sat down against a rock in a ravine and stopped. I didn't tell anyone about this. It wasn't the kind of thing that had tactical value. It was the kind of thing that settled into the quiet part of you and stayed there, adding its weight to all the other weights, becoming part of the permanent architecture of who you were after this. November came. The nights dropped below freezing. The creek ran faster with early snowmelt from the higher peaks. We distributed extra blankets from a supply run to an abandoned sporting goods store in a small town 20 miles north. A run that Todd led, efficiently, without complaint, returning with sleeping bags, thermal clothing, camp stoves, and a box of children's books that he handed to Rachel without comment. She stared at him. He shrugged and walked away. People were changing. The crisis was reshaping us into versions of ourselves we hadn't known existed, and not all of those versions were worse. Gabriel gained weight. Maria tracked it on a chart she kept in the medical tent, an upward line on a piece of graph paper that she showed me one afternoon with something close to pride. 7 pounds, 12 ounces, she said. That's good. That's on the curve. I didn't know what curve she meant, but the fact that curves still existed, that growth could still be measured and tracked and celebrated, felt like evidence of something I didn't have the vocabulary for. On a cold evening in mid-November, I climbed to the top of the eastern ridge for the last time in this story. I sat on the same rock I'd sat on weeks before, when I'd first looked down at the settlement and tried to make sense of what we'd become. The valley below was different now. The structures had multiplied. Smoke rose from the communal kitchen. The irrigation trench we'd dug caught the last light like a silver thread stitched through dark soil. Okafor's antenna stood on the opposite ridge, a thin line against the sky, reaching upward toward frequencies that connected us to people we'd never seen, but whose voices we knew. I could hear the creek. I could hear voices, low and overlapping, the sound of a community eating dinner together. Somewhere a child laughed, and the sound carried up the ridge with a clarity that the desert air allowed, and I held it in my ear for as long as it lasted. I thought about Site Meridian, still sitting in its valley, 90 miles south, empty now, its radar panels pointed at a sky that no longer needed watching. I thought about the TOC where I'd first heard that signal, the woman's voice, exhausted and precise, telling anyone who could hear that the cities were gone. I wondered if she was alive. I wondered if she'd found something like this. I thought about Danny Yoon, who was 20 years old and who walked into the desert because he couldn't carry the weight of what the world had become. I thought about Arthur, who died of heat under a tarp while we ran from the things that wouldn't stop walking. I thought about Officer Dominguez, sitting against a rock in a ravine with one shoe missing, finally still. I thought about Corporal Webb, holding a gymnasium door against the darkness so that a woman and a teenager and a baby he'd never met could live. I thought about Maria in the medical tent, charting the weight of an infant on a piece of graph paper, drawing an upward line in a world that only seemed to go down. I thought about Todd handing a box of children's books to a woman without a word. I thought about Rowan by the creek, holding a stone, carrying a 20-year-old's death like a debt she'd never be able to repay. I thought about the things on the ridge at Site Meridian, standing in the sun with their broken bodies and their empty faces, waiting for nothing, driven by something that had once been a brain and was now just a signal, an impulse, a hunger that had no purpose and no end. And I thought about how the distance between us and them was not as wide as we wanted it to be, because they persisted without reason, and so did we. The difference was that we could choose why. We could assign meaning. We could look at a valley with a creek in it and say, "This is worth defending." We could look at a stranger and say, "You are worth feeding." We could look at the future, blind, uncertain, probably violent, definitely hard, and choose to walk toward it rather than away from it. That was it. That was the whole thing. Not hope exactly. Hope is a prediction, and predictions require data, and we had no data. What we had was closer to stubbornness, a refusal to let the arithmetic be the final word. The food would run out, or it wouldn't. The infected would find the valley, or they wouldn't. The radio contacts would grow into a network, or they'd go silent, one by one. We didn't know. We couldn't know. And we kept going anyway. Because the alternative was Danny Yoon's walk into the dark, and we'd all seen where that led, which was nowhere at all. I sat on that ridge for a long time. The guitar below me switched to a different song. Someone laughed. The creek murmured its single, ongoing syllable. The stars were indifferent, as they always are, and the desert below the mountains was dark and vast and full of things that wanted to consume us, and we were small and few and badly supplied. And we were still here. That was enough. Not enough to promise anything, not enough to guarantee survival or rebuild what was lost, or answer any of the questions that kept me awake at night. But enough to sit on a ridge in the cooling air and think, tomorrow I'll help dig the irrigation trench. Tomorrow I'll check the Eastern Patrol route. Tomorrow I'll sit with Rowan by the creek and we'll talk about what needs doing, and then we'll do it. And then we'll do it again the next day. The signal that started all of this, that woman's voice on the UHF frequency, looping her warning into empty air, had said the cities were gone. She was right. They were. But she'd left out the second half of the message, the part she maybe didn't know yet. The part that took 90 miles of desert and 45 lives and 1 death and the worst heat I've ever endured to learn. The cities were gone, but we were not. And as long as that remained true, the frequency was still open. Someone could still hear us. And we would keep transmitting, not because we knew anyone was listening, but because the act of reaching out was, itself, the thing that kept us human. The fire below me flickered. The guitar went quiet. The valley settled into its nighttime silence. Not the dead silence of the desert, but the living silence of 159 people breathing in the dark. Each one carrying a story that no one else would ever fully understand. Each one choosing, for one more night, to stay. I climbed down from the ridge and went to my bunk, and lay there with my eyes open, listening to the creek, and for the first time in weeks, I did not think about what was coming. I thought about what was here. And eventually, without deciding to, I slept.